So this is going to be a session talking about how to create PBR visuals, so physically based rendered visuals and effects with no code using Unity. And I'm going to use a couple of features in Unity to show how to do this. So the talk is very visual. You'll see lots of pretty stuff. So most of this talk is actually going to be in the editor, actually showing how to set these things up. And some of the things I'm going to talk about is some PBR-lit shaders for glass and subsurface scattering and lots of cool things like this. Different lighting settings that you can change and adapt real time. How to set up volumetric fog, which is admittedly like very few components, very few settings. And then our new shader graph system for building shaders visually directly in the editor. So I'm now going to switch over to Unity and show you all these things in action. So I'm using here a template scene for when you start a new project in Unity using one of our new templates. And the template I'm using is the HD template. So this is going to load in all these new features like volumetric fog, HD lit shaders, and things like this for you to use in your project. And here we have a very simple sort of workspace area. And the workspace area is built up of lots of different things to show how each of these features can be all set up. So we have here some hard hats, some materials, wood, paint, brick, and all these different things all taking place in the scene. One thing I'm going to do now is actually bring in this statue. We're at the Venetian, so this is very fitting. And this is actually a scanned statue from a museum, which I then just basically imported and brought into Unity to use. And this statue is using our new HD lit shader. So if I now zoom into the, I need magnify. So the HD lit shader has a various set of properties to allow it to automatically set up some high quality visuals out of the box. And people keep asking for us to make sort of things in Unity seem simpler and have lots of tick boxes and sliders and things. So we're adding all these things for you to play around with. So for example, if I go to the material type of this statue, there is, for example, standard setting, but you can also instantly turn on subsurface scattering, translucency, iridescence, and things like that. One thing that we've tried to do is take a lot of the elements in Unity and actually keep them all consistent in the scene. So as I bring the statue around, it automatically adapts to the shadows, and lighting automatically adapts to the different situation. And if I zoom into the statue, we'll notice in the shader here that we can actually increase different values like metallic and smoothness. So instantly you can take any object in Unity and kind of add a metallic value or a smoothness value. And all your lighting and post-processing is all very consistent as you do this. One thing I keep talking about is lighting. So if I now turn off the directional light and sort of remove a lot of light from the scene and turn on one of our object lights, what you'll notice is that object lights now have physically based attenuation and fall off. So as I move this light around the scene and around the statue, you'll notice that everything is consistently glowing using those PBR values from that shader. So if I move this light into this position here, we have a nicer physically based fall off using the normal map or the mesh of the statue. Similarly, I can take this point light and add multiple instances. So I can make a nice red one here or a nice orange one. I could take another one and move that around, so on here. And you'll notice that as I move this statue around the environment, it's adapting automatically to all that real-time lighting with these point lights in our scene. Let me turn a couple of these off. Another light that we have support for in Unity now is a line light. So you can see here that this is basically a long line that's cast. Some people call it a lightsaber, and I'm going to see a lot of lightsabers and lots of demos in the future. But what this line light does is it allows you to create this volume of light and then position it and rotate it and put it into different situations in your project. So here we can have this line light sort of slicing through our environment and lighting up different things in this way. This was sort of a highly requested feature from a lot of people who were restricted by point lights or spotlights, and very easily we were able to add line lights using our new rendering systems and shaders. So we have our line light sort of being applied to our statue. Another thing that we can do now in Unity is apply lots of different types of shader properties. So if I take this statue's shader, which is using this kind of like opaque shader that we can apply smoothness and metallicness and things like this, we can also do things like apply glass. So if I add glass to this statue and then re-enable some of these lights, you'll notice that the glass is going to adapt automatically to this. So I don't have to change anything about the glass. It's automatically having refraction and having that real-time light applied to it. And another thing a lot of people ask for is subsurface scattering. So if I apply this to the statue like so. So what subsurface scattering does is it's the process of light entering sort of like a volume or a mesh, bouncing around inside, and then shooting out the other side. So the kind of texture has some kind of thickness. So it's common in things like honey or sap or any other sort of type of liquid or type of crystal or gem. So here we have the statue using our new subsurface scattering shader. And as I turn this on and off, you can see instantly that we have a lot more depth and a lot more thickness in the object, especially when we add different lights like this nice spotlight right here. So as I position it here and move into the statue, as I turn on and off transmission, you'll notice that without transmission, the light is going to hit the object as expected. But when we turn on subsurface scattering transmission, that light is going to come into the object, bounce around in the inside or the inside edge of the thickness, and then come out the other side. So automatically, we can add subsurface scattering to objects and have them update automatically. And of course, we can add a lot more lights. And you'll notice that the subsurface scattering on the object is taking all these different light data and light colors and sort of adapting as we would expect. So if I actually go back to that previous HD lit shader, it looks very different. So here we have that previous HD lit shader, which was just opaque and didn't have any of these extra settings. Whereas now, when I apply subsurface scattering onto it, we have these settings to change. Or we have this result. One of the other benefits of subsurface scattering is we have different thicknesses. So honey or some kind of liquid is going to be a lot less thick than, say, for example, something like marble. And currently, we've got a setup of some kind of marble for the subsurface scattering. So what I can do is I can actually change a lot of the values to adjust how thick this object is. So if we sort of lower the thickness, there's more transfusion from the light from the other side of the statue. So that's kind of sort of how the lights and how the shaders sort of interact, especially with the subsurface scattering. Another thing that we've added is volumetric fog. And typically, this has been quite difficult to implement into projects or in real time in Unity before. But we've kind of added this as a singular component. So we have this new component called a density volume. And if I turn that on, what you'll notice is the density volume will instantly add this kind of big box. And this big box is going to add this kind of very thick, dense sort of aura, which we can then use for different things. So if I turn off density volume, we don't even see that spotlight, but adding density volume instantly will take all the lights. I didn't even have to change the lights. It automatically takes them and adapts them accordingly. And I can actually add in way more lights, all of them casting shadows and doing different things. So you see with that density volume, instantly you're having the subsurface scattering applied to the statue, but then having this very thick fog taking place all around the statue. And if I select this fog, I can then sort of tweak the color. So, Mike, give me a color. 255, 255. So we now have disco. Thanks, Mike. Really useful. I'm joking. But you notice very quickly, without having to pre-render or pre-bake the scene, we have this real-time setting. Obviously, this is kind of for some kind of fog in this environment. And a lot of this is actually controlled from our new scene settings component. So what this does is this exposes a lot of sliders and a lot of properties for different elements of our scene. One is the sky, so you can set things like sun size convergence and atmosphere thickness. So if I actually zoom out and then adjust this, you'll notice that it's not doing anything. One sec. Turn back on the lighting. So we can now actually adjust and change some settings or elements of this big, bright skylight that's taking place in the scene. But another thing is, if I now turn back on that density volume, again, it's just a component or a game object, using these volume settings, we can add another layer of volumetric fog. And this will basically create some kind of a darker persistence in the scene. So this is light blue, but again, I can change this to different settings. So if I change this to this nice orange glow, you'll notice that each of those point lights are then being picked up by this. And if I now grab this object and move this around the scene, you'll notice that the light is then bending around the object. So we can move it here, and it's casting shadow. You can see that the subsurface scattering is taking place as we move the object in front and behind the light. You notice it's all adapting automatically in our scene. And that is pretty bright. As well as having a lot of these built-in shaders for subsurface scattering and glass and things like that. And again, if I switch back to that original rock and change all these settings, or let's go to glass. So you notice that the glass is being affected by the light as well. You'll notice without having to touch the light or touch the fog, it's automatically factoring those changes. So you don't have to go and tweak each thing individually as you change these different things. And as well as having these new sort of like shaders which have all these different settings and different options, we have a tool now in Unity called Shader Graph, which allows to sculpt kind of logic for shaders and build shaders for different purposes. So here is obviously a shader used for subsurface scattering, and we can see the light transfusing through the statue. But maybe we want to use something and sculpt our own shader that does something. Like maybe we want to take our statue, but also apply some kind of rock or tiles to it. So I've already pre-made that. So if I apply this onto the character, we'll notice here that we have a shader which has a couple of different textures which you can input, some sliders, and this kind of detail texture. And let's zoom back into our scene. And what we have here is basically a checkbox to enable some kind of marbling on the same statue, and obviously set tiling and all these different settings. And this shader, to do this kind of multiple sort of layer maps, is actually a node graph, which looks like this. So it may seem a little alarming at first because you've got lots of different nodes with lots of data being passed around. What you'll notice is that as you zoom in, you get little previews of what's actually taking place directly inside this shader. With all of the nodes traveling from left to right, we then have this end output. So we then can output different data. So for example, we can output albedo data, metallic data, how smooth is the object, does it glow and have emission, and have all these different settings. And each of these node blocks does something with that data. So here I've got the unwrap of the statue. That's what the statue looks like if the texture is just applied to a standard UV. Here we're taking that and multiplying it via a color. And then we're passing this through this kind of brick-like texture and combining these two things together. So now when I go to my dashboard or parameter list in the top left corner, I can change different colors or change different settings. And you notice that as I change the settings, all the previews are changing down the stack. So let's say we want to make this, instead of red, we want it to be green or yellow or red or blue. All the different nodes are then showing what that preview is what that shader is going to do. So rather than sort of writing shader code and compiling and see the result, or rather than writing code and clicking a button, waiting 5-10 minutes for it to compile, it's basically going to apply those changes automatically, and you can kind of see it happening all down the river of data. We have similar for the normal map, and you can build all these different node graphs and all these different shader graphs very easily by clicking spacebar, and then you have this full menu of all these settings. So let's say, for example, I want to get some kind of noise value. We can have a node where you can input in a UV and a scale and output that end result. So you can basically have a lot of data flow into shader graph, do something with it, and then output out the other side. So if I now leave shader graph and go back into our volumetric fog scene, which looked very different at the beginning of the demo, what you'll notice is that this statue is using that statue map, the one that looks like this. So we have all the different outlines and little maps, but it's combining it with another texture or another set of textures. So here it's combining with these paving tiles. So very easily I can switch these paving tiles to use sort of these stone tiles. Or let's say, for example, I want to switch them to use this kind of wood type tile. And if we turn off or turn on our directional light, make it super bright, turn off volumetric fog because we don't want to see what it looks like so. You can notice that we can change our statue using shader graph and the different outputs and logic that I've already set up to see what our character or setup looks like in these different settings. So kind of the point I'm trying to make here is that we have lots of built-in shaders for subsurface scattering and different things, which I can obviously change and have our now glowing object, glass, rock, or our shader graphed wood sort of composition. You can use all these built-in shaders, or you can use shader graph to sculpt what your end visual is going to look like, and then have all the settings sort of adapt automatically to that. I'm going to turn back on the volumetrics because this looks really eerie and very creepy, and just shows how straightforward it is to set all this stuff up. And obviously you can move around the character and have all the volumetric fog bend with the character in the scene, which is pretty cool. So that's pretty much the end of my session. Sort of covering PBR lit shaders, a few different light settings that are there, volumetric fog, which you can add very easily in Unity, and everything automatically adapts to it, and shader graph to create sort of some kind of node. So it's like kind of a rough intro. Obviously, what I covered or what I showed has a lot more depth to it, but we have a lot of information online about shader graph. We have videos and things, and we have projects and examples that you can go and download if you search for these things, or come talk to me afterwards, and I'll show you the best route to get more information on these tools. That's pretty much the end of my talk. You can download all those tools directly inside Unity. Download everything I showed you is using what you can download right now. Maybe not on this conference Wi-Fi, but maybe on good Wi-Fi later on. And you can get that exact scene of the workshop environment by when you create a new project in Unity, go to Unity, New Project, and select the HDRP template, and it will set up a lot of those elements for you to play around with. I'm going to be around for the rest of the day and the rest of the conference. If you have any questions about what you saw, or graphics in general in Unity, or Unity in general, or animation, camera tools, anything really, come talk to me and say hi, and I'll be curious to see what you're working on. Thank you.